He thought embarrassing her would be effortless, but the moment Emily Carter stepped through the heavy glass doors of Iron Forge Boxing Gym, something invisible shifted in the air, the kind of shift you only recognize after it's already too late. The gym itself pulsed with its usual rhythm, gloves thudding against leather bags, sneakers squeaking across the worn rubber floor, the faint metallic scent of sweat and determination hanging thick under harsh fluorescent lights, but in the center of it all stood Jake Reynolds, 6'2", broad-shouldered, undefeated in every local circuit that mattered, a man who had built his reputation not just on skill but on presence, the kind that made people step aside without being asked, and when his eyes landed on Emily, standing quietly near the entrance in a simple gray hoodie and black leggings, he didn't see a challenge, he saw an interruption. A faint smirk curled at the corner of his mouth as he wiped his hands on a towel, already deciding what she represented in his world, already placing her into a category he had never questioned before, and around him, others followed his lead without thinking, their glances quick, dismissive, curious in the way people are when they believe they already understand the story unfolding in front of them. Emily, meanwhile, said nothing, her posture relaxed, her gaze steady as it moved across the room, not with uncertainty but with quiet awareness, as if she were measuring something deeper than what anyone else could see. And when Jake finally approached, his footsteps slow, deliberate, carrying the confidence of someone who had never needed to prove himself twice, the chatter around them softened just enough to make space for what everyone assumed would be another harmless moment of entertainment. "You looking for the fitness class?" he asked, his tone light but edged with something sharper, something that invited laughter without directly demanding it, and right on cue, a few voices echoed behind him, low chuckles bouncing off the walls. But Emily didn't react the way they expected. She didn't shrink, didn't rush to explain herself, she simply met his gaze for a brief second, calm, unreadable, before answering softly, "No," and that single word, quiet as it was, seemed to land differently than anything else in the room, though no one could quite say why. Jake tilted his head slightly, amused, stepping back just enough to gesture toward the open space of the ring as if presenting a stage. "Then maybe you're in the wrong place," he added, his voice carrying now, inviting the room to watch, to witness what he assumed would be a predictable outcome. But as Emily took a slow step forward instead of turning away, something subtle changed again, not in the noise, not in the movement, but in the feeling, like a current shifting direction beneath the surface, unnoticed by most, ignored by Jake, but undeniable to anyone paying close enough attention. And for the first time that day, the gym didn't feel like his territory anymore. It felt like something else entirely, something waiting to be revealed. And though he couldn't explain it, Jake felt it too, just for a fraction of a second, before brushing it off with a confident smile, completely unaware that in choosing her as the center of attention, he had just stepped into a moment that would quietly dismantle everything he thought he understood about strength. The faint ripple of tension did not disappear after Emily stepped forward. It settled into the room like a quiet challenge that no one wanted to acknowledge out loud, and Jake, still wearing that easy confidence, leaned against the ropes of the ring as if inviting her into a space he believed he fully controlled, his voice carrying again with casual authority as he called out to the others, telling them to give her some room, not because he respected her, but because he expected a moment worth watching. Something light, something forgettable, and a few people gathered closer, their expressions a mix of curiosity and amusement, phones half raised as if they already anticipated a story to share later, while Emily moved without hesitation, stepping between the ropes with a calm precision that did not match the role they had assigned to her, her movements unhurried, deliberate, like someone who understood exactly where she was and why she was there. And for a brief second, the smallest flicker of uncertainty crossed Jake's face, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for him to feel, before he dismissed it just as quickly, rolling his shoulders and adjusting his stance with a practiced ease. "We will keep it simple," he said, almost generously, as though he were doing her a favor, his tone softening just enough to maintain the illusion of control, but beneath it lingered that same quiet condescension that had already filled the room. And Emily simply nodded once, her eyes steady, her breathing even, not a trace of hesitation in her posture, which only seemed to draw more attention from the crowd now leaning in closer, their laughter fading into a kind of expectant silence that no one had planned, because something about her refusal to react was beginning to feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable. And Jake stepped forward lightly, testing the distance, his movements relaxed, almost playful, as if demonstrating. Rather than competing, circling just enough to remind everyone of the difference between them, and still, Emily did not rush, did not flinch, she simply adjusted her footing, subtle, controlled, as though she were listening to something deeper than the noise around her, and that was when the rhythm of the room began to change again, not in sound, but in attention, as eyes that once dismissed her now lingered a little longer, trying to understand what did not fit, while Jake, sensing the shift, without fully grasping it, decided to end the moment quickly, to reclaim the narrative before it slipped further from his hands. "Any time now," he said with a small laugh, gesturing casually, expecting her to hesitate, to prove him right, but Emily did the opposite. She stepped in just enough to close the distance, her focus narrowing with quiet clarity, and for the first time since she entered, the space between them felt charged, not with aggression, but with something far more unsettling. Something controlled, something intentional, and Jake felt it again, that brief, inexplicable pause in his certainty, the kind that only lasts a heartbeat before instinct takes over, and as the room held its breath without realizing it, the unspoken question hung in the air, no longer about whether she belonged there, but about what everyone had missed from the very beginning. The moment stretched just a fraction longer than expected, and in that fraction, everything revealed itself to those paying close attention, not through noise or force, but through control, because Emily did not rush forward or react to Jake's casual provocation. She simply moved with a quiet precision that seemed almost out of place in a room built on intensity, her feet adjusting subtly against the canvas, her posture aligned in a way that spoke not of uncertainty, but of familiarity, and Jake, still holding on to his confidence, stepped in again with that same relaxed rhythm, expecting her to follow his pace, to fall into the pattern he dictated, but she did not. She held her ground just long enough to disrupt it, just long enough to make him hesitate, and that hesitation, though brief, did not go unnoticed by the room now watching in complete silence. Because something about the exchange no longer felt like a demonstration, it felt like a shift, like a balance tipping in a direction no one had predicted, and Jake felt it too, the subtle break in control, the moment where instinct replaced certainty, and he tried to recover it quickly, adjusting his stance, moving again with more intention this time, but Emily was already there, already reading the space between them with an awareness that did not match her quiet appearance, and when she finally acted, it was not rushed or dramatic. It was measured, deliberate, a single motion executed with clarity and purpose, so precise that for a split second, it did not even register as action, only as change, a sudden stillness that replaced movement, a shift in energy that rippled outward through the room, and Jake stopped, not because he chose to, but because something in that moment forced him to reassess everything he thought he understood, his expression tightening as realization began to surface, slow and undeniable, while the people around them leaned in without realizing they had moved, their earlier amusement gone, replaced by something quieter, something heavier, and Emily lowered her hand just as calmly as she had raised it, her breathing unchanged, her gaze steady, not challenging, not aggressive, simply present, and that presence carried more weight than any display could have, because it revealed something far more unsettling than strength. It revealed control, and Jake, standing there in the center of his own gym, felt that control for the first time not as something he possessed, but as something he had just lost, and in that silence, where no one laughed and no one spoke, the truth settled in with quiet certainty. This was never her first time in a place like this, and whatever everyone thought they were witnessing, it was only the beginning of something they were not prepared to understand. The silence did not break immediately, it lingered, stretching across the ring and into every corner of the gym, settling over the spectators who now stood completely still, as if any movement might disturb whatever had just happened, and Jake remained in place, his confidence no longer effortless, his posture no longer relaxed, because something deeper had shifted, something he could not dismiss with a joke or a smirk. And for the first time, he looked at Emily not as an interruption, but as a question he could not answer, his eyes narrowing slightly as he tried to reconstruct the moment in his mind, to understand how control had slipped without warning. But Emily did not press forward, she did not capitalize on the shift, she simply waited, her stance unchanged, her breathing steady, giving him space not out of hesitation, but out of certainty, and that restraint unsettled him more than anything else. Because it removed the illusion that this was accidental, it suggested intention. Experience, something practiced and precise, and around them, The room began to adjust, the earlier amusement now replaced with a quiet attentiveness, people lowering their phones, leaning in closer not to capture a spectacle, but to understand it, and one voice near the back whispered something barely audible, a question rather than a statement, asking who she was, and that question spread without words, passing through glances and expressions, because no one in that room had an answer, not even Jake, who straightened slightly, regaining some of his composure, his jaw tightening as he forced a small, controlled smile, attempting to reclaim the narrative that had slipped from him. That was, good timing, he said, his tone measured, as if reframing the moment into something manageable, something he could explain away. But the words did not carry the same weight they once would have, not after what everyone had just witnessed, and Emily met his gaze again, calm, unshaken, her voice quiet when she responded. It was not timing, and those 4 words landed heavier than anything else in the room, because they did not challenge him, they corrected him, and Jake felt it, the subtle shift from authority to uncertainty, the realization that he was no longer guiding the moment, he was reacting to it. And for someone who had built his identity on control, that realization was difficult to ignore. And so he adjusted again, stepping back slightly, recalibrating, deciding that if this was no longer a demonstration, then it had become something else entirely, something he needed to understand before he could dominate. But as he studied her more closely now, taking in the way she held herself, the way she moved without wasted energy, the way her focus never wavered, a different thought began to form. One he had not considered before, one that made the room feel smaller around him, because the question was no longer whether she belonged there, but how long she had been operating at a level no one had recognized, and Emily, still standing with that same quiet presence, did not need to say anything more, because the truth was already unfolding in front of them, slowly, deliberately, and the more it revealed itself, the clearer it became that what Jake had treated as a moment of entertainment had quietly turned into something far more dangerous to his sense of certainty, something that could not be undone with confidence alone. And as the weight of that realization settled in, the room remained silent, not out of confusion anymore, but out of respect for something they were only beginning to understand. The air in the gym no longer belonged to Jake, and everyone could feel it even if no one dared to say it out loud, because the man who had always controlled the rhythm now stood in a space that no longer moved to his command, and that realization pressed in on him quietly, steadily, like something he could not push away, and for a moment, he considered ending it there, brushing it off with a laugh, turning the moment into something small again, but pride did not allow that, not in front of an audience that had already begun to question what they thought they knew. So instead, he stepped forward once more, slower this time, more deliberate, his eyes fixed on Emily not with amusement, but with calculation, trying to read what she was, trying to find the flaw that would restore his certainty. But Emily did not give him anything to work with, her stance unchanged, her presence calm, as if the outcome of this moment had never been in doubt for her, and that quiet confidence unsettled him more than any challenge ever had, because it suggested something deeper than skill. It suggested experience shaped in places far beyond this gym, and the people watching could feel it too, the shift from curiosity to recognition, as if they were beginning to understand that they had witnessed only a fraction of what she was capable of. And Jake, refusing to let that understanding take hold, adjusted his posture again, forcing control back into his movements, determined to re-establish the balance that had slipped. But even as he moved, there was a hesitation now, subtle but undeniable, the kind that only appears when doubt has already taken root, and Emily saw it, not with surprise, but with quiet acknowledgement, as if she had expected it all along. And when she spoke again, her voice remained soft, steady, carrying just enough to reach him without needing to reach anyone else. "You do not have to prove anything," she said, and those words landed differently than anything before. Not as a challenge, not as an insult, but as a truth that stripped away the performance entirely, and Jake felt it, the weight of it, because for the first time, the situation was no longer about strength or dominance, it was about understanding. And in that moment, he realized he had misunderstood everything from the beginning, and the room, still silent, absorbed that realization with him, the earlier laughter now distant, almost forgotten, replaced by a quiet respect that had not been offered freely, but earned through something far more powerful than force. And Emily, standing there without tension, without urgency, did not need to do anything more, because the shift had already happened. the balance had already changed, and as Jake slowly lowered his guard, not in defeat, but in recognition, the truth settled over the room with undeniable clarity. Strength was never what he thought it was, and the woman he had dismissed as weak had just redefined it without ever raising her voice. No one moved, not immediately, because the moment had already shifted beyond anything familiar, and the gym that once echoed with confidence and routine now held something quieter, something heavier, as if every person inside had just witnessed a line being crossed without realizing when it happened, and Jake stood there, his breath steady but his thoughts no longer aligned with the certainty he had carried just minutes before. His gaze fixed on Emily, not with challenge now, but with a searching intensity, trying to understand what could not be undone, and Emily remained exactly where she was, her posture relaxed, her presence grounded, as if the outcome had never been in question, and that calm did not provoke him, it unsettled him, because it removed the need for reaction entirely, and for the first time, he was not responding to an opponent, he was confronting a reality he had overlooked. And the longer the silence stretched, the more it revealed, not just about her, but about him, about the assumptions he had made, the confidence he had built without question, and the way it had all quietly unraveled in a single moment that no one could now ignore. And around them, the spectators shifted subtly, not stepping away, but leaning in with a different kind of attention, one no longer driven by entertainment, but by recognition, because something about Emily's presence had redefined the space, had rewritten the unspoken rules that governed it, and Jake felt that change settling in, not as defeat, but as clarity, the kind that does not arrive all at once, but builds in quiet realization. And when he finally spoke again, his voice was different, lower, measured, stripped of the performance that had defined him before. "You have trained before," he said, not as a question, but as an acknowledgement. And Emily met his words with the same steady gaze, offering no explanation, no validation, just silence that confirmed more than any answer could, and that silence carried weight, because it forced him to confront the truth without distraction. And for a brief moment, the room seemed to hold its breath again, waiting for something more, something louder, something definitive. But Emily did not move, she did not escalate, she simply existed in that space with a quiet authority that required nothing else, and that was when it became clear to everyone watching that this moment was never about proving strength, it was about revealing it, not through force, but through restraint. And Jake understood that now, not in theory, but in experience, as he slowly stepped back, creating space not out of fear, but out of respect, a respect that had not been given freely before, but had been earned without a single word. And the gym, still wrapped in that lingering silence, absorbed the shift fully, because nothing needed to be said anymore. The lesson had already taken hold, and as Emily turned slightly, as if preparing to leave without claiming anything from the moment she had transformed, the weight of what had just happened settled deeper into the room, leaving behind a question that no one could answer yet, not about what she had done, but about how much more she had chosen not to show. Emily's movement toward the rope should have ended the moment, but it did not, because something in the room refused to let it close so easily, and Jake felt that before anyone said a word, the quiet pressure of unfinished understanding settling over him as he watched her turn, not with urgency, not with triumph, but with the same calm intention she had carried from the beginning. And that calm forced him to confront something far more difficult than any challenge he had ever faced, the realization that this was not a moment he controlled, it was one he had stepped into without permission. And for a brief second, pride urged him to call it back, to say something that would restore the balance, something that would make the room feel like his again, but the words did not come as easily now, because anything he said would have to exist in the truth that everyone had just witnessed, and that truth was no longer in his favor. And the people around them remained still, their attention fixed not on what had already happened, but on what might happen next, because Emily's silence had created something unresolved, something that lingered just beneath the surface. And Jake understood that if he let her walk away now, the moment would define him in a way he could not control. So he spoke again, his voice steady but quieter than before, stripped of the edge it once carried. "Why did you come here?" he asked, not as a challenge, but as a question he genuinely needed answered. And Emily paused, her hand resting lightly against the top rope, her back still turned for just a fraction of a second before she faced him again. And when she did, there was no hesitation, no guardedness, only that same composed clarity that had unsettled him from the start. "To train," she said simply, and those two words carried more weight than anything else she could have offered, because they removed every assumption that had been placed on her, reducing the moment to something honest, something undeniable, and Jake absorbed that slowly, the simplicity of it cutting through everything he had built around the situation, because in that answer, there was no need for explanation, no need for validation, only purpose, and the room felt it, the shift from spectacle to reality, as if everyone present had been reminded of something they had forgotten, and Jake nodded almost imperceptibly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, the kind that comes when understanding begins to replace ego, and though he had not lost in the way he once feared, he had gained something far more difficult to process, perspective, and Emily, seeing that shift, did not press it further. She simply stepped out of the ring with the same quiet control, leaving behind a silence that no longer felt heavy, but clear, and as she moved toward the exit, a few people instinctively stepped aside, not because they were told to, but because something in them recognized what had changed, and Jake remained where he was, watching her go, the noise of the gym slowly returning around him, but not in the same way as before, because now, every sound carried the memory of what had just unfolded, and as he stood there, the question that remained was no longer about her strength, but about how long she had chosen to remain unseen, and why. The door should have closed behind Emily and ended the story right there, but it did not, because something about the way she walked out carried a quiet weight that refused to be ignored, and Jake felt it long after she had stepped past the threshold, the faint sound of the door settling back into place echoing softer than it should have, as if the room itself was still holding on to what had just happened, and for the first time in years, Jake did not turn back to his routine, he did not call out instructions or correct someone's stance, he simply stood there, his gaze fixed on the empty space where she had been, replaying every second in his mind, not searching for mistakes, but for meaning, and the more he thought about it, the clearer it became that nothing about her presence had been accidental, not her timing, not her control, not even her restraint, and that realization settled deeper with each passing second, because it meant one thing he had not considered before, she had chosen exactly how much to show, and nothing more, and around him, the gym slowly came back to life, but not in the same way, the laughter did not return, the casual conversations felt quieter, more measured, as if everyone was still adjusting to a shift they could not fully explain, and a few of the regulars exchanged glances, subtle, questioning, because what they had witnessed did not fit into any category they were used to, and Jake noticed that too, the way the room now carried a different kind of awareness, and for a moment, he considered letting it fade, letting the day move on as if nothing had changed, but he knew that would not work, not this time, because something inside him had already shifted, something that would not settle until he understood it, and without saying a word, he stepped out of the ring, his movement slower than usual, more deliberate, as if each step carried a new kind of weight, and he moved toward the door she had just walked through, not with urgency, but with intention, the kind that comes when a question matters more than pride, and outside, the late afternoon light stretched across the parking lot, casting long shadows over the rows of cars, and for a brief second, everything looked ordinary again, until he saw her, standing near the far edge of the lot, adjusting the strap of a worn gym bag as if nothing about the last few minutes had been significant, and that image, simple as it was, unsettled him even more, because it confirmed what he had begun to understand. This had not been a moment for her, it had been routine, and as he approached, stopping just a few feet away, he realized that whatever he had thought strength looked like before no longer applied, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the confidence it once had, only a quiet need for clarity. "Where did you learn that?" he asked. And Emily paused, her hand still on the strap, her expression unchanged. As she looked at him, and for a moment, she said nothing, letting the question settle between them, before answering in a tone just as steady as before, "Some places do not advertise," and those words lingered in the air long after she turned away, leaving Jake standing there with a realization he could not ignore, that the story he thought he was part of had only just begun, and he had no idea how deep it went. Emily did not look back as she walked across the parking lot, and that was what stayed with Jake the most, not the movement, not the control, but the absence of any need to confirm what had already been understood, and he stood there for a moment longer than necessary, watching her figure grow smaller against the fading light, his mind replaying her words with a clarity that only sharpened over time. Some places do not advertise, and the more he thought about it, the less it sounded like a casual answer, and the more it felt like a boundary, something that was not meant to be crossed easily, and yet, he could not ignore it, because for the first time in years, something had challenged not his ability, but his understanding, and that kind of challenge did not fade, it stayed, it demanded attention, and back inside the gym, the rhythm had not fully returned, conversation still carried a lower tone, movements felt more deliberate, as if everyone had been reminded that what they thought they knew could change without warning, and Jake noticed that too as he stepped back inside, the familiar sounds now layered with something new, something quieter but more aware, and a few eyes turned toward him, not with the same expectation as before, but with curiosity, as if they were waiting to see how he would respond to something they had never seen him face, and for a brief moment, he considered brushing it off, turning it into a lesson, reframing the moment into something controlled, but that instinct did not hold the same weight anymore, because he knew that would not be honest, and honesty, in that moment, mattered more than appearance, so instead, he moved without explanation, crossing the gym floor toward the far wall where old photographs hung in mismatched frames, snapshots of past fighters, local tournaments, moments that defined the space long before it became what it was now, and his eyes scanned them slowly, not looking for recognition, but for something familiar, something that could connect what he had just experienced to something he already understood, but nothing matched, nothing explained the precision, the restraint, the quiet confidence that had filled the room, and that absence only deepened the realization forming in his mind, that whatever background Emily carried, it did not belong to the world he knew, and one of the younger trainees stepped closer, hesitant but curious, asking in a low voice if Jake knew who she was, and Jake paused for just a second before answering, not with authority, but with honesty, no, and that single word carried more weight than any explanation could, because it acknowledged something rare, something unfamiliar, and the trainee nodded slowly, stepping back without pressing further, sensing that whatever had begun that afternoon was not something that would be resolved quickly, and Jake remained there, his gaze drifting once more toward the entrance, as if expecting the door to open again. As if part of him believed she might return, but deep down, he understood something else entirely, that people like her did not arrive to prove anything, they arrived for a reason, and they left just as quietly once that reason was fulfilled, and the only question that remained was not whether he would see her again, but whether he would be ready when he did, because something about that brief encounter had already begun to change him, not in how he fought, but in how he saw, and as the last light outside faded into evening, that change settled in with quiet certainty, leaving behind a truth he could no longer ignore. The strongest presence in the room is not always the loudest one, and sometimes, it is the one that chooses to remain unseen. That night did not end the way Jake expected, because even after the gym emptied and the lights dimmed to a dull hum, the silence Emily left behind refused to fade, it lingered in the corners of the room, in the rhythm of his thoughts, in the way his usual confidence no longer returned as easily as it once had, and for the first time in a long while, Jake stayed later than everyone else, not to train, not to prepare, but to think, pacing slowly across the worn floor, replaying every detail, every movement, every word, searching not for mistakes, but for meaning, and the more he examined it, the clearer it became that what unsettled him was not her skill, it was her restraint, the deliberate choice to reveal only what was necessary, nothing more, nothing wasted, and that level of control did not come from casual experience, it came from discipline shaped over years, possibly in places far removed from anything he had known, and that realization began to shift something deeper inside him, something tied to the way he had always defined strength, because for the first time, he saw it not as dominance, not as display, but as precision, as awareness, as the ability to act without needing to prove, and that understanding did not settle comfortably, it challenged him, quietly but persistently, forcing him to reconsider the foundation of everything he had built his identity on, and as the hours passed, he found himself doing something he had not done in years, pulling out old records, flipping through archived photos, scanning names from past competitions, searching for any trace, any connection that might explain her presence, but nothing matched, no record, no mention, no familiar path that led to someone like Emily Carter, and that absence only deepened the mystery, because it meant her experience existed outside the systems he trusted, outside the recognition he relied on, and as he sat there in the dim light, the realization settled in with quiet clarity, that there were levels to this world he had never encountered, paths that did not intersect with his own, and people who moved through them without needing acknowledgement, and that thought stayed with him even as he finally locked the gym and stepped into the cool night air, the city around him quiet, almost still, mirroring the shift inside him, and as he stood there for a moment, looking out at the empty street, he understood something that would not leave him, that the encounter was not over, not truly, because moments like that did not exist in isolation, they led somewhere, they meant something, and as he exhaled slowly, the question that had begun earlier returned, sharper now, more focused, not just who she was, but why she had come here, and what she had seen in this place that made it worth stepping into, even for a moment, and though he did not have the answer yet, he knew one thing with certainty, the next time their paths crossed, he would not be the same person standing across from her, because something had already begun to change, something he could not ignore, and this time, he would be ready to understand it. The next morning arrived with a quiet clarity that Jake had not felt in years, the kind that does not come from rest, but from realization, and as he unlocked the doors of the gym, the familiar scent of leather and effort greeted him the same way it always had, yet something about it felt different now, not weaker, not stronger, just more honest, as if the illusion that once filled the space had been quietly stripped away. And he stepped inside with a slower pace, his eyes moving across the room not as a territory to control, but as a place to understand, and one by one, the regulars began to arrive, their voices low at first, their glances shifting toward him with an unspoken question that none of them needed to ask directly, because they had all felt it, the shift, the moment that had changed something in the room, and Jake acknowledged it without speaking, not with authority, but with presence, the kind that no longer demanded attention, and as the morning session began, he moved differently, correcting form with more precision, demonstrating technique with more intention, focusing not on power, but on control, and those who trained under him noticed it immediately, though they could not quite explain why, because it was not a lesson he announced, it was one he embodied, shaped by something they had witnessed but not yet fully understood, and as the hours passed, the rhythm of the gym returned, but it carried a different energy now, quieter, more focused, as if everyone had been reminded of something they had overlooked, and Jake felt it with each movement, each instruction, each moment of silence between actions, and yet, despite the return of routine, there was a space that remained unfilled, a question that lingered just beneath the surface, and every time the door opened, even for a brief second, his attention shifted instinctively, not out of expectation, but out of awareness, because he understood now that moments like that did not repeat themselves easily, and if they did, they came without warning, and just as the late morning light began to stretch across the floor, casting long lines through the windows, the door opened again, and for a fraction of a second, the entire room seemed to pause, not because they knew who it was, but because something in the air felt familiar, and Jake turned, not quickly, not dramatically, but with a calm readiness that had not been there before, and there she was, Emily Carter, stepping inside with the same quiet presence, the same simple hoodie, the same steady gaze, as if nothing about the previous day had been unusual, and yet everything about her presence carried a deeper weight now, not because of what she had done, but because of what she had revealed, and the room, though no one said a word, felt it immediately, the subtle shift, the quiet attention, the unspoken recognition that this was no longer a moment of curiosity, but something more, something that demanded respect, and Jake held her gaze for a brief second before nodding, not as a challenge, not as a test, but as an acknowledgement, and Emily returned it just as simply, stepping forward without hesitation, as if continuing something that had never truly ended, and in that moment, the truth settled in fully, this was not about proving anything anymore, it was about understanding something far deeper, something that neither of them had fully explored yet, and as the room watched in silence, the next chapter began, not with noise, not with spectacle, but with a quiet certainty that whatever came next would change more than just the way they trained, it would change the way they saw everything. No one spoke when Emily stepped fully into the gym again, but the silence this time was different, it was not confusion, it was awareness, and Jake felt it immediately, not as pressure, but as clarity, the kind that settles in when something unspoken becomes understood, and he did not move toward her the way he had the day before, there was no need for demonstration, no need for control. Instead he simply gestured toward the open space of the ring with a quiet nod, an invitation rather than a challenge, and Emily accepted it just as simply, stepping forward with that same measured pace, her presence calm, grounded, unchanged by the attention that now followed her, and as she stepped between the ropes, the room adjusted around her. People shifting not to watch a spectacle, but to witness something they had begun to respect, and Jake followed, his movement steady, deliberate, no trace of the earlier performance, only focus, and for a moment, they stood across from each other in silence, not as opponents, but as two people aware of what the other carried, and that awareness changed everything, because now there was no assumption, no underestimation, only observation, and Jake spoke first, his voice low but clear, "Show me." He said, not as a command, but as a request, and Emily held his gaze for a brief second before nodding, her stance settling into place with a quiet precision that seemed almost effortless, and what followed was not fast, not overwhelming, but controlled, deliberate movement, each step placed with intention, each motion connected to the next in a way that made the entire room fall silent again, not because they were surprised, but because they were beginning to understand, and Jake watched closely, not reacting, not interrupting, but learning, seeing details he had overlooked before, the efficiency, the balance, the absence of wasted energy, and in that moment, something shifted again, not in dominance, but in perspective, because he realized that what he had built through years of discipline was not being challenged, it was being expanded, and that realization carried a weight that humbled him without diminishing him, and when Emily stopped, lowering her hands with the same calm control, the room remained still, absorbing what had just been shown, and Jake exhaled slowly, not out of exhaustion, but out of recognition, because what he had just witnessed was not a display, it was a lesson, one that could not be taught through words, only through presence, and he nodded once more, this time with something deeper behind it, respect that was no longer earned through assumption, but through understanding. And Emily returned that acknowledgement without expression, as if it required nothing more, and as she stepped back, the space between them no longer felt like a divide, but a connection, something that had formed quietly, without force, and as the room slowly came back to life around them, the truth settled in with quiet certainty, this was not the end of a moment, it was the beginning of something neither of them had expected, something that would reshape not just how they trained, but how they understood strength itself, and for the first time, Jake did not feel the need to lead, because he had finally learned how to see. The room did not erupt when it ended, there was no applause, no loud acknowledgement, only a quiet stillness that carried far more weight than any reaction ever could, because everyone in that space understood something had changed, not just in what they had seen, but in how they would see everything moving forward, and Jake stood there for a moment longer, his posture no longer defined by dominance, but by awareness, his gaze steady as it followed Emily stepping out of the ring once again, not as someone leaving after proving a point, but as someone who had simply completed what she came to do, and that difference mattered, it settled into the room with a clarity that no one could ignore, because it stripped away the idea that strength needed validation, replacing it with something far more grounded, something internal, and Jake felt that more than anyone, because for the first time, he was not measuring himself against someone else, he was measuring himself against a deeper understanding of what he had been missing, and as Emily reached the edge of the gym floor, she paused, not turning fully, but just enough to acknowledge the space behind her, and for a brief second, her eyes met Jake's again, not with challenge, not with expectation, but with quiet recognition, as if confirming that something had been understood without needing to be spoken, and Jake gave a small nod in return, not out of habit, but out of respect, the kind that no longer needed to be proven. And Emily continued on without another word, the door opening and closing with the same soft finality as before, leaving behind a silence that no longer felt heavy, but complete, and the gym slowly resumed its rhythm, but not the same rhythm it had before, because now every movement carried intention, every correction carried meaning, and Jake moved through the space differently, not as someone in control of everything, but as someone aware of how much there still was to learn, and the people around him felt it too, the shift from performance to purpose, from assumption to understanding, and though no one spoke about it directly, the lesson remained, woven into the atmosphere of the place itself, and as the day moved forward, the echoes of that moment did not fade, they settled, becoming part of something larger, something that would shape every session that followed, and as Jake paused for just a second, his eyes drifting toward the door